The village of Thornmere sat at the edge of a dying kingdom, where the soil had forgotten how to grow wheat, and the rivers ran thin as old men's patience. Edric Ashwell was not the kind of man people noticed. He was 26, broad-shouldered from years of hauling water and splitting wood, but his clothes were patched so many times that the patches themselves had patches. His boots had holes in the soles he'd stuffed with dry grass. He owned 3 things of value: a mule named Biscuit, a small farmhouse with a leaking roof, and a stubbornness that his late mother had called his only inheritance worth keeping. He had come to the market in Thornmere's Square not to buy anything. He had no money to buy anything, but to sell the last of his autumn turnips and perhaps trade a bundle of firewood for a sack of oats. That was the plan. Plans, as Edric had learned many times in his 26 years of hard living, were simply stories you told yourself before the world laughed at you. It was a cold morning in late autumn, the kind where your breath floated ahead of you like a ghost. The market square was crowded with farmers, merchants, and the occasional soldier from the garrison up on the hill. Vendors shouted prices. Children stole apples. Dogs fought over fish bones in the mud. Edric sold his turnips quickly, too quickly, and for less than he'd hoped, and was just beginning to negotiate for oats when the crowd shifted. People began moving toward the far end of the square where a raised wooden platform stood, the kind used for announcements and, sometimes, auctions. Sale of property. Sale of property, a reedy voice called out. Come and place your bids, good people of Thornmere. Rare goods this morning. Rare goods. Edric followed out of nothing but boredom and the cold. He pushed through to get a view of the platform. On it stood a man named Corvus Drell, a trader of the sort that made honest merchants embarrassed to share the profession. He was thin, with a pointed chin and rings on every finger, wearing a fur-lined coat that was expensive in the way things are expensive when someone else has paid for them against their will. Beside him stood 2 large guards, and, between the guards, a figure that made Edric go very still. It was a woman. She was tall, taller than most men in the crowd, with a powerful, straight-backed build that spoke of someone who had not been broken by hard living but shaped by it. She wore rough clothes, the kind given to people to cover them rather than warm them. Her hands were bound in front of her with rope, and over her head was pulled a heavy sack, coarse burlap tied at the throat, so that no one could see her face. She stood completely still, not trembling, not hunching, not doing any of the things a frightened person does on a platform in front of strangers. She simply stood, chin slightly raised beneath the sack, as though she were waiting for a door to open rather than standing at an auction. That stillness was the first thing that struck Edric. What manner of sale is this? Someone near him muttered. Indentured labor, someone else replied in a low voice. Drell's been doing it all through the eastern counties. Picks up people who owe debts, sells their labor contracts. That's barely legal. That's exactly legal enough for Drell. Corvus Drell raised his hands for quiet and smiled the smile of a man who has practiced smiling in mirrors. Gentlemen and ladies, of course, what we have here is a simple labor contract. This woman is bound by debts she cannot pay. Those debts have been purchased by my company. Whoever buys this contract today gets 5 years of labor, legally binding. Cook, field hand, whatever you need. Starting price, 5 silver. The crowd murmured. 5 silver was not a small amount in Thornmere, but it was extraordinarily cheap for a 5-year labor contract. Edric watched the woman on the platform. She had not moved. The bidding began and, strangely, died almost immediately. One farmer bid 5 silver, looked at the covered figure, and seemed to lose his nerve. Another bid 6, then pulled back. There was something about the woman's posture, that absolute, eerie stillness, that made people uncomfortable. They wanted to know what was under the sack. Drell refused to remove it. He said it was part of the contract conditions and would not elaborate. People grew suspicious. If the trader was hiding her face, what was wrong with it? Rumors ran through the crowd like fire through dry grass. She was horribly scarred. She was diseased. She was cursed. She was something other. Bids collapsed. 3 silver. Then 2. 1 silver, someone called, laughing as a joke. 1 silver bid. Do I hear 2? Drell called, his smile looking somewhat more strained now. Silence. And then, without entirely understanding why he was doing it, Edric Ashwell opened his mouth. 1 copper, he said. He had, in his pocket, after the turnip sale, exactly 1 copper coin and 11 buttons. The crowd turned to look at him. Corvus Drell stared. Even the woman on the platform moved her head slightly toward the sound of his voice, though she couldn't see. "This is a 5-year labor contract, sir," Drell said, very slowly, as though speaking to someone exceptionally foolish. "I heard you," Edric said. "1 copper." There was a long silence. "Sold," Drell said, through his teeth, "for 1 copper." They conducted the paperwork at a small table at the edge of the square while the crowd drifted away, losing interest now that the spectacle was done. Edric signed his name. Slowly, he was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one, and handed over his single copper coin. Drell's guard cut the rope from the woman's wrists. Edric reached up and carefully untied the cord at her throat and pulled the sack from her head. And there it was. The reason people had bid low and then lower and then not at all. She was not human. Or, rather, she was not entirely what the people of Thornmere called human. She was Valdhari, what Southerners rudely called half-bloods, though that term missed the nuance entirely. Her mother had been from the mountain clans of the far north, tall people with ash-gray skin and eyes the pale silver-gray of winter ice. People who had lived in those mountains for centuries before any southern kingdom had names. Her father, apparently, had been an ordinary man from somewhere in the Midlands. She had inherited both, the height and the ash-gray skin and those startling silver-gray eyes, and also the ordinary arrangement of features, a wide, level brow, a straight nose, a firm jaw, that made her face striking rather than alien. She was young, perhaps Edric's age, or a year or 2 older. There was a cut healing above her left eyebrow, and she was thinner than she should have been. She looked at Edric. He looked at her. "Hello," he said, because he couldn't think of anything else. She opened her mouth, and then she spoke. And Edric knew immediately, in the way you know certain things without being able to explain them, that whoever this woman was, she was not what Drell's paperwork claimed. Because the voice was not the voice of a debtor in a labor contract. It was low and precise and completely, utterly calm, and it said, "You've made an interesting purchase. I should tell you, honestly and immediately, that I am not going to cook or field work for 5 years." Edric blinked. "May I see the contract?" she said. He handed it to her. She read it far faster than he had, her silver eyes moving across the page. "This is partially fraudulent," she said, in exactly the same tone someone else might say it might rain later. Clause 7 references a debt registry number that doesn't exist under current law. And my name is spelled incorrectly, which actually matters because the whole contract is built on my identity as the debtor. She folded it neatly and handed it back. "You could have this contract voided in any court with a half-decent magistrate. I'm telling you this because you paid 1 copper for me on what appears to be an impulse, and I'd rather deal with an honest person than a foolish one, and I can't yet tell which you are." Edric stared at her for a long moment. "My name is Edric Ashwell," he said. "I'm mostly a farmer. I'm not rich. I don't know why I bid. I'm not going to make you cook or field work." He paused. "What's your name?" "Seravyn," she said. "Seravyn Tor Valdis." A pause. "That's my full name. Most people in the South don't bother with the Tor Valdis part." "I'll remember it," Edric said. Something shifted in her eyes. Barely, just a fraction, but it was there. "You should know," she said, "that Drell's men may follow us. He doesn't sell contracts to lose them for a copper. He'll want to recapture me and claim the contract sale was a mistake." Edric looked across the square. One of Drell's guards was watching them. "My farm is 2 miles north," Edric said. "My mule is faster than he looks. Can you ride?" "Yes." "Then let's go." Seravyn Tor Valdis looked at Edric's farmhouse for a long time before she said anything. "It has a hole in the roof," she said finally. "I know. A significant hole. I'm aware. The east wall is also pulling away from the foundation. I've noticed. How long have you lived here?" 5 years. She looked at him. "It's been a difficult 5 years," Edric said, with dignity. She almost smiled. It was barely there, a slight softening at one corner of her mouth, but Edric noticed it because he was watching and filed it away. He gave her the bedroom, the only bedroom, and slept in the main room by the fire, which was genuinely fine because the main room was warmer anyway. He had very little food, but he made what he had, a soup of dried beans and the last of the autumn root vegetables, with bread that was 2 days old, but still good if you didn't hold it up to the light and look at it too carefully. She ate the way someone eats when they have not been allowed to eat properly for a while. methodically, without waste, without complaint, grateful in a way she didn't express in words, but only in the completeness of attention she gave the bowl. After dinner she told him about herself, in the same level, precise way she did everything. She was from the northern mountain clans originally, though she had spent the last 8 years traveling. She had trained, from childhood, in the Valdhari tradition of what Southerners called law-speaking, a combination of rhetoric, memory, negotiation, and law that the mountain clans used to resolve disputes between villages. She could memorize a document after reading it once. She could find the structural weakness in any argument the way a mason finds the flaw in a wall. She spoke 6 languages. She had come south 3 years ago looking for her younger brother, who had followed a work contract into the southern kingdoms and stopped sending letters. She had found him, eventually, in a labor camp outside a city called Varith, working under exactly the sort of fraudulent contract she had identified in Drell's paperwork. She had gotten him free. She said this without elaborating on how, and Edric didn't ask, and sent him home. But in the process, she had made an enemy of the man who ran the labor camp, a man with connections to several regional traders including, it turned out, Corvus Drell. They had caught her 6 weeks ago. The sack on her head was Drell's idea. He was afraid that if buyers saw her face and heard her speak, they'd be scared off entirely, or worse, she'd talk them out of the purchase, or talk them into something he hadn't planned. He wasn't entirely wrong, Edric said. No, Seravyn agreed. He wasn't. She looked at him steadily. Why did you bid? Honestly, Edric thought about it. You were standing too still, he said. People who are frightened try to make themselves small. You weren't making yourself small. I wanted to know why. She was quiet for a moment. The answer, she said, is that I was angry, not frightened. And anger is easier to be still in. They came 2 days later, which was faster than Edric had expected, and right on time according to Seravyn, who had apparently spent those 2 days both helping fix the east wall. She was stronger than she looked and knew more about construction than Edric found entirely explainable, and quietly preparing for this. There were 3 of them, 2 of Drell's guards and a man in a coat who carried documents and did not have the look of a fighter, which meant he was either a lawyer or a bluffer, and both were possible. Edric went to the door when they knocked. Seravyn stood slightly behind him and to the left. The man in the coat said the contract was being disputed. He said the sale had been improper. He said Edric was to return the labor contract and the woman named in it, and Drell would refund the 1 copper as a gesture of good faith. Edric looked at Seravyn. Seravyn stepped forward. She said, in a voice that was so calm it seemed to lower the temperature of the room slightly. Please cite the legal statute under which this contract can be recalled after legitimate sale. The man in the coat stared at her. She said, furthermore, I'd like your name and your license of legal practice in this county, which is required before you can represent a client in a contract dispute under the Trade Code of 1189. The man in the coat said, I'm not a licensed lawyer, Seravyn finished. I thought not. You're a clerk, which means anything you say here has no legal standing. She tilted her head slightly. And the guards with you are making a threatening posture outside a private home, which under county law constitutes unlawful intimidation, which is actually a crime. And if you've come here without the knowledge of a garrison officer, you're exposed to a penalty of... All right, the clerk said. He was sweating. All right, we'll go. They went. Edric closed the door. There was a long silence. You know, he said, I didn't go to the market that day with any intention of changing my life. No, Seravyn said, moving back to the wall she had been reinforcing. People rarely do. Winter arrived in Thornmere the way it always did, suddenly and without apology. They fell into a rhythm, the way people do when they are sharing a small, leaking space and are both too practical to waste time being precious about it. Edric knew farming, the soil, the animals, the seasonal logic of it. Seravyn knew everything else, it seemed. She could calculate load-bearing angles for the roof repair. She knew which wild plants along the forest edge were edible. She could stretch a week's food into 10 days without anyone going hungry. She also, it turned out, was teaching him to read faster. He'd mentioned, offhandedly, that he read slowly. She'd offered to help in the same tone she offered everything. Direct, not unkind, simply factual. He'd accepted, mostly because saying no felt like admitting the problem was unfixable. She was a good teacher. patient in a way that wasn't soft, which suited him because he didn't want soft patience, he wanted to actually learn. By the first snowfall, he was reading twice as fast. By midwinter, he'd borrowed a book from the village schoolteacher and was working through it every evening by firelight. He wasn't sure when the arrangement stopped feeling like a temporary situation and started feeling like something else. It happened gradually, the way most important things happen, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. He noticed she started to sleep better. The first week she had slept lightly, waking at small sounds, which he understood and said nothing about. By the second month, she slept through the wood settling in the cold. He noticed this and felt something he didn't quite have words for yet. She started, slowly, to talk more. Not just information. Information she had always provided readily. That was simply how she communicated. But other things. Memories of the mountain clans. The way they held disputes around fire, and each person was required to argue the opposing side before making their own case. Memories of her brother, who was apparently a cheerful disaster of a person who had once traded a perfectly good horse for a bag of beans he'd been convinced were magical. The way the sky looked in the north before a snowstorm. A specific shade of gray-white she'd never found an exact word for in any of the 6 languages she spoke. Edric listened. He was a good listener. He had always thought better with his ears than his mouth. He told her about his mother, who had worked this farm alone for 12 years after his father left. He told her about the drought 3 years ago that had taken most of his livestock and a year's crop, and the way he had sat on this same floor and genuinely not known if he would make it through the next year. He told her about Biscuit the mule, who was old now and deserved better food than Edric could currently afford, and this seemed to cause him more genuine distress than his own poverty did. She listened. She was, he discovered, better at listening than she appeared. She didn't fill silences she didn't need to fill. That was rarer than people thought. It was deep winter, the point where darkness comes early and the cold is a presence rather than just a temperature. When she found him sitting on the step of the farmhouse in the freezing night, looking at nothing. She sat beside him. "What's wrong?" she said. "Nothing, really. You've been quieter than usual for 3 days. Something's wrong." He was quiet for a while. "I'm happy," he said finally, which I know sounds like nothing's wrong. "But I've been thinking about how strange it is. That the roof leaks less now. And there's more food. And the evenings are better than they've ever been. And I'm not sure what happens when spring comes." He looked at the snow on the fields. "The contract is fraudulent. You said so yourself. You don't owe me anything. You have a brother in the north and a life, and you know 6 languages, and you could go anywhere." Seravyn was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "Going north." His stomach dropped, the way a stone drops in cold water. Fast, clean, final. "It makes sense," he said. "Yes," she said. "Which is why I find it interesting that every time I think it through carefully, I conclude I'd rather stay." He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the field. Her silver eyes were steady, the way they always were, but there was something in them that he was beginning to be able to read. This was new, a recent development, like a language being slowly learned. And what was in them was not indifference and not calculation. It was something simpler and considerably more terrifying in its simplicity. "You'd stay," he said carefully, "here. On a small farm with a recently repaired but still structurally questionable east wall, and a mule that eats too much and a man who reads too slowly," she said. "Yes." A pause. "I'm good at identifying weaknesses in arguments, Edric, and I cannot find a sufficient argument for leaving." "That's the least romantic thing anyone has ever said," he told her. She did smile then. Fully, for the first time since he'd met her, the whole expression, and it transformed her face the way sunlight transforms a winter field, suddenly and completely. "I know," she said. "I thought you'd appreciate that." He laughed, the kind of laugh that comes up unexpected from somewhere deep and warm. "I do," he said. "I really do." Spring, when it came properly. The fields turned. Edric planted with advice from Seravyn, who had read 3 books on agricultural soil management she'd borrowed from the county library 15 miles away and returned with precise notes on companion planting and crop rotation. He did not tell her that this was perhaps excessive research for a small farm with limited resources. It seemed like the wrong moment to say so. Corvus Drell was investigated by the county magistrate's office in March, following a formal complaint filed by someone who had clearly done their legal research extremely thoroughly. The complaint cited 9 specific statute violations across 11 different labor contracts. Drell's business was suspended pending review. This information reached Thornmere as rumor and then as confirmed fact, and when it did, Edric said nothing but noticed that Seravyn looked out the window at the spring fields for a long, quiet moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close. He fixed the roof properly in April, with help from a neighbor named Old Martin who knew what he was doing and seemed to find Seravyn's structural calculations both impressive and slightly unsettling. They made a formal agreement, not a contract. Seravyn had opinions about contracts and what they were and weren't good for, but a spoken arrangement of the kind the mountain clans used, said aloud, witnessed by Biscuit the mule, who was unmoved by the occasion but present for it. The arrangement was simple. The farm was half Seravyn's, the work was shared, the decisions were made together, and the earnings were equal. Also, Edric was going to learn a 7th language, because Seravyn had decided to teach him the mountain tongue of the Valdhari, and he had not successfully argued against this. "You'll make mistakes constantly," she told him. "I know," he said, "and you'll have to keep going." "I know. It takes years." Seravyn. "What?" "I know," he said. "That's fine. I like things that take years." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "I've noticed." 5 years after the day a poor farmer paid 1 copper coin for a woman with a sack on her head, the farm at Thornmere's northern edge was known for 3 things. The first was its wheat, which was remarkably good for the soil type, thanks to a crop rotation system that other farmers in the county had begun quietly copying. The second was the small law-speaking practice Seravyn ran from the farm 2 days a week, where she helped villagers with contracts, disputes, and paperwork, charging what people could afford and sometimes nothing, and winning, with remarkable consistency. The third was the argument. Not a bad argument. The kind that had become locally famous because it was both ongoing and, witnesses agreed, extremely well-reasoned on both sides. The argument was about whether a mule named Biscuit, ancient, stubborn, and now eating better than some people in the county because Edric refused to hear otherwise, should be allowed to sleep inside the farmhouse during winter. Seravyn argued no. There were structural concerns. There were hygiene concerns. There was the matter of the recently repaired floor. Edric argued yes. It was cold. Biscuit was old. The floor had survived worse. The argument had been ongoing for 2 winters. Everyone in Thornmere agreed that neither of them was really trying to win it.